It's very exciting from a data standpoint to kind of take, science that's developed in a lab and try to kind of implement how it would get tried and adopted. And then that's the nice part of being on the commercial side that I enjoy in the data analytics space, right? Is it gives meaning to numbers.
The following is a conversation with Arvind Balasundaram, his first time on this podcast, but certainly not the last. Arvind is an executive with a track record of influence and expertise in pharma industry, currently serving as the executive director of commercial insights and analytics at Regeneron Pharma. He is one of the most thoughtful minds when it comes to unraveling the complex dynamics between data analytics and healthcare. And he's someone I could sit down and have a deep conversation with about the present and future of this very crucial industry. Today, we deep dive into the nitty-gritties of what makes the American pharma landscape tick. From questions about the state of the industry, controversies surrounding it, to the future propelled by the new technologies. Arvind provides a comprehensive view. All this and more in this gripping conversation that you won't want to miss. This is our podcast, Simulated Reality. And now, dear listeners, here's Arvind Balasundaram. We kicked off our conversation with an intriguing question about the perception surrounding the US pharma industry. Why do you think there is this whole thing around US, if I look at it from the very outside perspective, right? The US pharma industry and the healthcare industry in general appears very broken, and I can be wrong out there. If you see the bills which is coming out, it's massive bills.
Yes.
Right? There's definitely from outside perspective something which appears wrong, and one try to wrap around his head on this whole issue and try to figure out, read some stuff around it. It just appears too much broken, and maybe I'm wrong, but what do you think is the underlying issue out there? And if there is something according to you, why cannot that be resolved?
Yeah, that's a great question, Master. First and foremost, I want to thank you for the opportunity. I really want to call out the work that AIM's doing just to kind of bring the whole intelligence in AI and ML together for practitioners. So thank you for that. So getting to your question, I think what you're bringing up in pharma and biotech, right, is the major issue comes down to our consumption model. If you look at it, unlike, let's say, retail or financial services, our end consumer is removed from whoever dispenses a prescription or whoever pays for a prescription. This creates great discontinuities in data. Going back a few years, we look at the legacy of how this information was picked up. We don't get anywhere close to kind of the linkages you get, let's say, in a consumer packaged goods space, where, let's say, if you or I went to a grocery store, we bought a cereal, you redeemed a coupon, you have all of that kind of in that same sequence. So the data is very easy to kind of capture all together and then do things with it. In healthcare, it has never been the case, right? Because we have three major players really. Your patients who consume it, your physicians who dispense scripts, your payers who pay for scripts, and they all have kind of been operating in their own way. Some of them with paper-based systems, some of them with laptops. So the linkages of all that data has taken a while to come together. It's happened. Now it's happened, but it's still got discontinuities in the way it's set up that limits what you can do, for example, with analytics. And so we're a little behind everybody else. But that said, from a futuristic standpoint, healthcare is going to become more and more important. So I would tell you the issue we contend with in healthcare in general is we need to do a 0 to 60 in 15 seconds, if you will, right? Because we've started behind people. We have an infrastructure that is kind of disconnected, that's coming together. But then, all the capabilities are kind of accelerating at a pace which is not giving us a comfort level to settle in one place. And I think that's what you're seeing all over, right? So a very broad answer to what you're asking for, but I think that's what you're seeing, and I think we'll get over the hill on that, but it's going to take a little bit.
Largely, if you also think about it, right, the pharma industry was the first adopter of data analytics because of the clinical trial and things like that.
Yes.
But if you see it now as compared to the other industries, it appears to be a lot more laggard if you compare it with, let's say, banking or retail, for example.
Yeah.
How is it that that transition from, let's say, a data analysis and very core statistics on the clinical trial has not transitioned into the other areas of pharma?
Yeah, so this is a key gap, right? Is I think, for example, I work in the commercial analytics space, which is very different from the clinical analytics space, right? In a clinical analytics setting, or most clinical modeling occurs within a trial, right? So you have your data fairly well controlled. What I deal with, for example, is behavior. And when you're talking about behavior, it's outside of a lab setting, it's in a clinical setting. It involves various channel dynamics, multiple players in that channel. And once you have disorganized data in that channel, you're really looking at a whole different, analytic system. So even though you may have the capabilities in clinical, and it's true of any company, right, is clinical is very, and you're right, because some of the early statistics work, clinical trial designs, they were all pretty important in even formative designs of analytics. But those are control settings, right? And those are regulated settings. It's very clear what the objective is. When you kind of get to the commercial space, especially if you look at the evolution of the industry, right? We've had so many different things just translate into practice, right? How people prescribe and consume medicines. We started, for example, with oral medicines, which are simpler, right? Because somebody sees a pill. Then we went to the era of DTC, where the consumer became a big part of the process. At Regeneron, for example, I work in primarily in biologics. These are large molecules which require injections, and that's a whole different ecosystem already, right? Because a lot of these are administered, for example, in a physician's office, which means the patient's got to go there. So those nuances kind of all introduce bottlenecks and continuities, if you will, in the behavioral chain, right? And then you have supply chain dynamics, you have cold chain dynamics, for example, with COVID, for a vaccine to get into somebody's system, it's got to be available at, stored in the right facility. Depending on the disease, if it's oncology, sometimes you got to go to academic center. So all these discontinuities really introduce a very different universe for us on the commercial side, as opposed to what people have on the clinics. I mean, I'm not saying there are not challenges there, but it's a different challenge, and I think it's much more streamlined and well developed than we have on this side.
If we keep aside that clinical trial and the whole data analysis out there, correct me if I'm wrong, a pharma industry or a pharma company would largely work like a retail organization, where there's a supply chain, there is a retail buying that can happen at a storefront or at a physician. That would require the same kind of thought process in terms of analysis and data governance, etc., that which a typical retail organization would have it. You see, so you're saying that there is still a bottleneck when we compare it from a typical, let's say, Walmart or folks, or let's say a boutique manufacturing organization for that.
Yeah, it's different in that the stimulus and response have a lag. For example, if I fell ill, right, I went to my physician, the physician wrote a script. That script has, let's say, I get a prescription for some product that I'm not covered in my formulary in a healthcare plan. There'd be a substitution. That substitution would then be dispensed to me at a pharmacy. All those are discontinuous. So if you take the retail example, right, if that's akin to my saying I'm going to, a grocery store to get, I don't know, some brand of cereal. For some reason, the cereal's available, but I cannot consume that cereal. You don't have those discontinuities, right? So there's a little bit of that. There's all kinds of, channel dynamics that happen with, access issues, and, you could have a product, but, the dynamics in terms of the brand itself and how it should be consumed, right? The parameters of the brand are kind of devoid from the decision-making process of whether that brand can be made available to a patient. So those things are massive bottlenecks, right? And not bottlenecks in a it should exist or not exist sense, from a data sense, right? Reconciling those decisions, you need them all together to create that continuous change, right? And that's the struggle we have.
And coming back to the first question, what do you think can be the solution for a data continuity issue like that?
Yeah, so what I think the fact that we're in, cloud computing, and that has obviously been helpful, right? Because we have these big streams of data that before used to reside either on independent server, and then now they all exist. They can be accessed easily. Now it's getting them all linked, right, and doing them without compromising privacy and those types of things. That's where the governance is critical for us, right? So you're absolutely right, Bhaskar, in that governance is coming to the top, right? But it's really because we need to tokenize things, or we need to develop things that all are able to talk to each other given these discontinuities, and that's just happening, right? In fact, if we look at data that's been platformed for provisioning for analytics consumption, we've been a little behind the rest of the others, but we're there, right? And what's nice about pharma biotech applications is the scope of what we can do with these data is immense, right? Because we have a lot of future planning to do, because healthcare is never going to actually go away, and with the aging of populations, I mean, India is an exception, right? But everywhere else, it's a very major issue for us, and that's where a lot of the capabilities like AI and ML are going to be really necessary, because data is growing to a point where we do not see potential things that can there are trends there we don't even see, right? They're also important for us in terms of what the future pipeline brings, right? So to understand the context of what's available today, let's say in oncology, we're at real steps in terms of treatment paradigms, right? We're in CRISPR-Cas9 technology, we're in silencing RNAs. These are all very, very different in terms of what they're going to bring as benefits to patients and physicians. But how do you articulate into a future climate, that something's coming that will have a price tag, but then has a benefit that is, completely different from what's available today, right? That's going to be the challenge, right? And that to me is the promise of what our data can do for us, and why it's going to become very important for us.
But then I saw that just after COVID, the revenues doubled from almost 8 billion to 16 billion in 2021. I'm hoping that, or I'm assuming, because of COVID is what led this doubling down.
Some of it, yes. But the Regeneron, there's some caveats, right? And you can see this if you go into our company page. But our area of focus has always been monoclonal antibodies, and but the other model we have is we home grow our assets, right? For most part, our assets are they're really good assets, but they've been developed in our labs. Even Dupixent, where we have an alliance with Sanofi, that product was actually sourced in our labs, right? So much of it, I think, has to do with the science in the company. The science, having been at other companies, I feel is very pure in intent, in the sense that the company has always pursued what is good for patients, right? And the science has a purity to it in terms of how it's delivered. We look to do the same on the commercial side, right? So my job is really to take the leadership in science that all our scientists have got in our labs, and bring that into the clinic, fit that in the context of behavioral practice, and where patients need something, they should get it, and where patients don't need something, it's incumbent on companies to inform them they shouldn't get it, right? So there's that whole mandate, and I think that's a philosophy of the company, and the nature of the drug discovery and development process has really benefited our products and the acceptance of our products, and I think from the credibility side, the company has a lot of credibility because of its philosophy and outlook, and so that's what you're seeing, right? And so a lot of the early work, to your question in terms of the revenues, they happen because of the timing of some of those milestones, right? Mm. There was a lot of investment early, and because of the due diligence and rigor and the management of risk by keeping it internal and really studying these things, we've been able to produce fairly good assets that have distinctive value, and I think that's what you're seeing in terms of that growth, and I foresee that as the company has stated, and we don't do a lot of forward outlooks, but our development in oncology, our investments, they're all, in the public domain on our side, and you'll see they're very distinctive on the science, and I expect that, we will have the same success forward.
Have COVID changed the pharma industry in some shape or form? Uh, the pharma industry in USA is very vast. It's huge.
Yes, yes.
And if you look at some of the the big players, there's very distinct. This is a distinction appearing post-COVID, where there seems to be winners and then there seems to be a few losers, which was not the case before
Yes.
COVID. How has this whole thing changed?
That's a great question, Bhaskar. I mean, the simple answer is not just yes, but wholeheartedly yes, right? And on many dimensions, right? Right. I think it changed the psychology of forward goal setting. We were in a, for example, when we used to do, let's say, forecasting before COVID, we would all kind of default to what I would say, there's different states that can take place with certain odds of occurrence, and this occurs with this is possible with this is possible with that, and that worked great. When you had COVID, you had even in randomness a presentation that became uncomfortable. For example, we had no idea what variants we were looking at in the thick of COVID. That had huge ramifications on the workforce. That had huge ramifications on whether our reps could go into a clinic to talk to physicians. It had huge ramifications on whether patients can go into clinical offices, because we are primarily in a biologic space, right? So the patient can't just pick script. They can, if it's an RX, method, but if it's a buy and bill, or, where they've got to go into the office to, let's say, get an injection, when COVID presents, it completely changes that whole thing, right? So what I like to talk about is, I think what COVID did was it took us from, I would say, all possibilities, to the question that everybody is being asked now is I don't want to know what's probable. I want to know what's possible, right? So it's an extra layer of, I don't give me N states that might manifest. Give me the 3 or 4 states that will manifest. And that's another very interesting issue when you think about it, right? Is now we're in the domain of, can we ourselves rationalize, and I'm going back to, the Google flu pandemic days, right? You're going to need, I think, some assistance now to try to predict some of these unforeseen outcomes, because we can't, just the way we've been doing it, predict these things, right? And so that's one of the reasons why there's a maturity needed on how data analytics gets used. That's one way.
You're saying right after COVID, it became a lot more nuanced,
more uncertain, less formalized, data, make more use of the data, more openness to unknown patterns, as opposed to reliance on more naive legacy type of dependence.
That's a positive change.
That's a very positive change, absolutely. But this is just one change, right? The second change is just in, how do you, let's say, talk about products? How do you promote products? How do you discuss products? Do you go virtual? How do you take content to a physician, right? So this brings up another issue, right? Is what is the right content to deliver to a physician? How should it be delivered, or to a patient, right? And that brings up the notion of, how do you package content? Because content is just exploding, but the time to deliver that content is shrinking, right? And we never used to have to worry about that as much as we have to do now. So there are all these types of things, which is why I think you'll see in the industry itself, a much more open approach to newer capabilities, because I think without those capabilities, we just can't go back to what we had, because the parameters of, that working have significantly changed since COVID.
And there is a distinction between the winners and losers. Do you think that happened because of COVID, that they were?
It might be, but the industry has always had that cycle, right? So I remember, when I started at Pfizer many years ago, through all the different companies, there's a cyclical process just because of the nature of the business we're in, right? Every drug discovery program has imminent risk, right? Because we're regulated, we have to go through pivotal trials, we have to show, certain incremental markers of endpoints those endpoints have to not only be clinically relevant, they have to be behaviorally relevant for you to get success in the marketplace. That's a pretty tall order, right? And not everyone at all times can hit all of those, right? So you do have the nature of cycles where some companies have very strong development programs at some point in time, and then you kind of phase out there because you've been investing in what you have. You've also got to invest in what you're going to have, and so that balance is hard to kind of consistently produce sometimes, which is why you see a little bit of that. I think there's a bit of that that's kind of there as well, and not just COVID. But broadly as an industry, yes, there's been acquisitions. I remember when I started 30 years ago, there were like
Regeneron Pharma just acquired something. There was news on.
Regeneron. Yeah, we just got Decibel Therapeutics, which is in the hearing loss space. And as a company, if you look at our our company page, we are not into direct acquisitions as a company. We've never done that in the past, but we've had a couple of Checkmate. We acquired an asset, Decibel, we just announced. But the intent there, as the company has always said, is we recognize if you can have everything, the latest new toys in drug development, discovery, and clinical paradigms, right? It's just too expensive. So what the company has chosen to do is, we'll do what we do well, and things that others do well, we will look to partner with them on. So we partner with, for example, Alnylam.
And Sanofi as
right.
the one.
Yeah, Sanofi was our early one, but Sanofi, it's primarily on Dupixent right now and a few other compounds, but Libtayo, which is the start of our oncology base, we actually bought the product back from Sanofi, so we own it outright now. Because it's critical to our oncology future. It was one of the reasons why we developed cemiplimab, and so overall it's all of those issues, I think, is why you see again some companies doing better than others. It comes down to ultimately what is the philosophy a company uses to kind of sustain value in the marketplace, right? And some companies, the larger companies, will acquire assets as part of routinely, they look at strategic alliances, they look at licensing and development. And if you hit it, it's great. I remember when I was at Bristol Myers Squibb, we were up against, I think Gilead on their Hep C asset, which ended up being prohibitively expensive to acquire, but it did extremely well for Gilead, right? So that's one strategy that you have. The downside of that is it comes with risk that you don't fully understand, right? Because it's an external asset. Do you know safety inside out? Do you know all the efficacy parameters? Do you know the subpopulation risk? Probably not, right? That you do know better if it's your own asset, right? And so there's always this balance of, how much is an opportunity which is externally acquired going to deliver, because it might give you a science that you didn't know you could get, but at the same time it could also, load you with risks that might not even launch at the end of it. So it's how much appetite you have for that, and that kind of thing, right? And different companies choose different mixes of that. At Regeneron, we've always, looked to our own science, our own ability to use that science for patient need, and that's been the formula at Regeneron for most part.
I'll stick to the COVID part a little bit more. Do you think that because of the whole COVID thing and vaccine getting to the public very, very quickly, what we are going to see is much faster clinical trial and drugs coming faster than pre-COVID era?
It might be, but I don't think there's a direct correlation, because I think one of the things we definitely don't want is any compromise in guidelines and safety to the patient, right? And I don't think we will see that. COVID was a very interesting situation because we were in a pandemic, right? And for example, even our cocktail, all the companies, not just Regeneron, all the companies had to work with the agency in order for therapeutic intervention, right? Because any new therapeutic intervention has good side and a potentially unknown side, right? And so I don't think speed will ever happen because of, a pandemic or I don't see that. But, technology and whether how technology influences attainment towards, endpoints and trials, could that possibly accelerate things? Possibly, and we're seeing different things even at the agency in terms of, what can be submitted, what can be used. All of that will evolve over time. And but it's a good question. But I would tell you, acceleration is, I don't think even the companies want that, right?
I mean, there's
Yeah.
not just need. I think the need is there, but given all the regulation and all that, there's still a pushback, and the companies also think let's wait it out and let's do our job well.
Correct.
And then take it to the public.
Correct.
And then to the FDA.
Yeah.
And I was looking at, there is this Netflix series which is very popular right now, The Painkiller. Have you seen this? Which is going on right now?
Yeah. No, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard about it.
It's a good one. It's about Purdue Pharma and the whole issue around Oxycontin.
Yeah, Oxycontin, yeah.
Why do you think we see, and this is not the first time that something like this, of this massive scale, has happened around opioids, etc. in US. Why do you think something like that happens so much, very frequently, given that the regulations are very, very stringent out there around?
Yeah, and this is an interesting question, right? And I'm not sure how to even answer that, because part of it is I've read different theories of, okay, what went off the rails? Was it over-prescribing? Was it whatever, right? In most of the companies I worked in, we have always been very, like, we all do all kinds of, we have all kinds of requirements in terms of what can and cannot be done. So, I don't know how much of it is just, stuff that happens in spite of things being done a certain way. It's hard to answer that, right? And it's unfortunate at the end of it. The intent always is, when you develop medications, that it has appropriate use, that the appropriate use has the desired end benefit without any consequences, right? And this whole, abuse issues that have come up, there's a social dimension to it.
Absolutely.
Which, you don't always have control over. There's, all you can really do is, and there are stringent requirements. For example, I remember when I worked at Johnson & Johnson on a product that had fentanyl in it. The product got approval, we just chose not to launch it because of concerns that, there could be abuse because of storage and things like that. So companies do make, on the pharma side, I don't think the public out there recognizes it sometimes, but there are some very important decisions that are made with patient safety in mind, right? And I think companies, as a rule, tend to be more prevention-oriented than, get into a situation. So it's really hard to see. Maybe I should see that movie to understand a little better. But I think there's a lot of social, mixes to it. Maybe the answer to that is we have to kind of look at, and I'm sure that's already happening because of the opioid issues. How do you kind of contain, broader dissemination of these things beyond, appropriate use? That is really the question on the table, right? I don't think, especially as we go, for example, to oncology and other specialty distributor drugs, these are pretty potent drugs, right? But they're up against really hard to treat diseases. And these cause immense pain and suffering to patients, right? So how do you balance, getting newer therapies to people, at the same time making sure only those people get it, right? And so I think you'll see that whole space, whether it's the distribution model, whether it's, the containment, whether it's, criteria to prevent abuse that companies need to meet. These are all going to mature, obviously, but these are learning steps because we're all in a different universe, right? In terms of how people communicate, what things are going around. And so I'm very optimistic that we as a society, we learn out of these things. And I think companies clearly have always been very strict about these things, and that will become stricter, right? That's what I would tell you.
What is the difference that you see when you move from, let's say, Bristol Myers Squibb or Johnson & Johnson to Sanofi, and now with Regeneron Pharma? What is the difference that you see in terms of the data analysis that you'll have to deal with?
That's a great question, right? I think it's all a question of maturity. So the way I try to answer that, and I talk to people, for example, when they come into Regeneron, I got to tell you, I love Regeneron and my experience there because my first biotech experience. It's also a highly innovative company, and that innovation goes beyond just clinical innovation. There's an appetite for disruption when it's for the patient good, which is very honest, right? And so a lot of us, when we come into Regeneron, even in an analytics capacity, what I'm looking to do, for example, AI ML, is actually develop stuff out of data that will help patients because that's in our DNA as a company, right? And that's very different from some of, all companies have that. But you kind of sense a bit more of that at Regeneron because we're a smaller company, and it's just the way the company kind of does things is very different. But, all the companies I've been at have all had that kind of in the overarching tone. Johnson & Johnson had a credo, Sanofi, I was there briefly, we had, on the other side of the Regeneron Alliance, I saw elements of that. Pfizer, when I first joined, I was very lucky in that I, got to launch a lot of the early blockbusters like Lipitor and Viagra and all of those. It's very exciting from a data standpoint to kind of take, science that's developed in a lab and try to kind of implement how it would get tried and adopted. And then, for example, now looking at, the excitement of launching Lipitor or Zithromax, azithromycin, and seeing my dad take it now, routinely. It's kind of nice, right? And
It's a popular drug in India.
Yeah, it's but that's the nice part of being on the commercial side that I enjoy in the data analytics space, right? Is it gives meaning to numbers and what I love about ML and AI, Bhaskar, which is what rocks my boat, is now you're talking content, we're talking rich media, being able to, let's say, bring in patient experience. We have a drug called dupilumab at Regeneron, which is indicated, for several atopic disorders like asthma and atopic dermatitis. These are extremely pain-inducing. For example, with atopic dermatitis, very young patients, they scratch themselves, they bleed when they sleep. And you can see bed sheets, stained with blood. It's just really horrifying to think what people go through, right? But when you can look at, numbers and you can look at, social media exchanges, you look at conversation, you look at images, and you bring all of that together in some form of patient experience and engage them in what would make them feel better, whether it's the clinical benefit of the drug, whether it's how it's used, whether it's, walking them through the nature of a disorder outside of any drug that we sell. I mean, that's a very passionate endeavor, right? And that's the beauty of, I think, what I would tell you I do and my group does, that we come into work to be able to do this. And to me, that's what's exciting about when you talk about generative AI, let's say, right, is how can I take all of that stuff, right, and deliver something meaningful to someone who's suffering, right? And it's a very, very noble pursuit of AI, right? That's what I'm really excited about. And it's been that way in all companies. Obviously, we didn't have AI when I was at Pfizer. We were,
Right.
with it. But, you had your own joys of, how information kind of takes to realization of clinical benefit. And it's a very small thing you do. But, in a biotech, the other big difference is there's much more intimacy between someone like myself on the commercial side and scientists in our lab, right? And as companies get bigger,
How's that?
you participate more in terms of listening to, some of the clinical rationale as to why, products follow the course they do. You understand the science a little deeper because you've been involved in some of those discussions. As you get into bigger and larger pharma, you have many more layers and much more organized units for that interaction. So you're a little bit more removed from that science.
Does it also require you to kind of speak their language as well?
Sometimes, but I went to a liberal arts school, like I tell everybody, my job is to learn, right? And it's at Regeneron, I spend more time learning what I don't know, which is fascinating, right? Because it contextualizes what I do. I can sit and do numbers, right? But to apply it in the right context, to take science as it should be understood and deliver that to a base of patients who are experiencing pain, that requires listening and being able to carve out, a story that makes sense on that science and the data that you see to the patient, right? That narrative requires the context, right? And in generative AI, the whole contextualization with transformers and stuff is going to require that scientific context. And much of that content will have to come from my clinicians, right? So it's a really exciting and learning journey. But that is one of the things that I think is very rejuvenating with the new capabilities we have in data analytics.
What do you think about generative AI as a new technology? There is definitely a lot of hype about it, but there are two groups of people. One is saying there's just hype and it'll go away. There's a set of folks who are saying no, it's real. Let's try it out. Let's try to adopt and let's see what's happening.
Yeah.
What is your take on this?
I would tell you I'm an optimist, right? But that said, I will tell you feasibility of these is going to be a very important point going forward, especially in a business context and scaling these capabilities, right? And what I mean by that, the reason I'm excited and an optimist is I think we have to step back. We're getting caught up too much in the chat GPT-4 and this lawyer did that, and that's great. But let's step back and see what have we done in terms of analytic engines, and it's profound, right? One is we are now saying that we can go beyond the training restrictions in a data set in a machine learning paradigm, right? That to me is very exciting, that we have something that can use that training, but then can also develop a context to generate new things.
Absolutely.
Right? That's a profound, especially when you have massive amounts of data. That to me is a point of inflection change. Now, how we choose to use that is where I think as a practitioner community, a lot of the work, for example, you're doing at AIM in terms of, educating everybody against a common language, it really needs to go there. Kind of like what explainable AI did, right? And saying, hey, AI is great, but then it's got to be explainable. But, they kind of went down the path of, let's reduce bias, let's minimize hallucinations, those types of things. We also need that with feasibility, right? If I'm going to, let's say, scale a generative AI, model of some kind, whether it's a GAN model or whatever across different therapeutic areas, I'm going to have to go to my management and show, is this a wild goose chase with you just shove everything up at the top and something comes out? That's not going to work, right? So now the community and what I'm trying to really work with folks on is, can we bring some kind of connectivity between what goes on top and what comes out? Can we filter what goes on top to the outcomes that we realize? And will that help guide the cost of this process? Could we bring something akin to what we used to call statistical significance in the older traditional models, right? Can I give up some quantity to get quality? Yes, I'll lose some precision, but is that loss of precision enough to lose where I can still make a decision, right? We really need to go there for industrialized AI systems, and that's what I'm calling feasibility of AI, right? And I think I saw an article in The Economist last week, so I'm sure I'm not the only one going there, right? But I think it is going to start becoming,
On the second set of people, the optimist, one of the issues that they are facing, they talk very vehemently about that, is that, look, generative AI is good, we want to adopt this, but that doesn't mean that my budgets are increasing or I am getting more people to work on it. So at the end of it, what is translating it for me or my group is that my churn prediction model can wait. Let me work on this new stuff. And that's where a lot of challenge is coming in, that the usual BAU around AI or data science which was happening is kind of getting sidelined, and then they're kind of trying to work up on generative AI and their use cases. Is that a viable thing, or is this a workaround?
I think as things mature, we will see that trend kind of shift, right? I'm a deep believer that even things like deep learning have not been fully exploited, at least in analytics in my industry, right? And So there's a lot that we know that we should be investing in. Generative AI, yeah, it's the new toy, right, as you're saying. And yes, it will lead to some obvious efficiencies, process efficiencies in companies, but that's not going to be the long-term story of generative AI, right? To me, it can't, this whole equation can't just be about costs. It's got to be about return on investments, right? And when you take that model, you got to look at the basket of investments, right? And am I in a company going to invest in, deeper learning through more hidden layers and more, complex extraction, backpropagation, things of that nature to get to a really solid outcome that's more precise versus, going on a wild goose chase where I don't have, these are things that we're going to have to deal with, right? And right now, generative AI appears to be winning because, there's no common metric. Nobody is looking at the basket of investments. But once, it matures, like I was saying earlier, and it goes within, actual business settings where people are having to go for budgets,
Right.
then budgets become a return on investment conversation, right? It's not about costs, it's about returns relative to that cost.
So you're saying right now people are still not going for budget approvals, and it's too early for that as well?
Yeah, they are, but they're kind of, a lot of it is happening under enterprise AI, and those are, either innovation budgets or, but to continue this forward, right? Especially, given the leaps and bounds by which even generative capabilities are increasing day by day, at some point the organization has to look at it as, is this a sustainable strategy, right? I'm constantly investing in something without really knowing, what am I getting for it, right? We're going to get there. And once we get there, there is going to be a much more formal process of evaluating these things, right? And that is going to come down to assessment of how expensive it is.
Yeah.
And for example, in my space, data is not open source. My data is very expensive. It's getting more and more granular. Every therapeutic area tomorrow gets a level of granularity that is deeper and more expensive. I'm having to link things. As we go into omni-channel type settings, I've got all kinds of little data here and there that I've got to kind of stitch. It's all very expensive, right? I've got to platform it, I've got to provision it, I've got to link it, and then I've got to model it, right? So when I have a budget conversation, it's not just whether it's generative AI, but what else is involved for me to use generative AI. And that's going to become the way this conversation is going to go, right? And so I think some of the hype will balance. I think companies are already taking a hard look at, how much of it is really things we need and what is nice to have. Let's look at what we must have first. And that's where the discrimination of return on that investment is going to matter, in my mind.
Let's talk about your India team and India office. A lot of organizations obviously have a captive unit here. Regeneron has a captive unit not far away from our office.
Yeah.
Here. There is a obvious need for something like this, but from your perspective, where is that need coming from?
Yeah, so clearly, for us to stay ahead of the curve, we have to kind of in a growth phase, right? Any company in a growth phase is going to have a lot of cost to incur just in terms of, on-site, versus off-site and hybrid offshoring type spaces. The issue for a company like ours has always been, can you create a data environment in another place that is, pretty secure, right? Because of all kinds of information that we deal with. I think that whole business has also matured, right? In the sense that now you can actually do this. We couldn't do this some time ago, but you can do this, right? And so with the whole globalization of things, right?
A lot of people are doing it already.
Exactly.
The processes and the
as a company, we've been expanding into other geographies, and so it makes a lot of sense. And in India you have tremendous talent, and not just the old production talent, but you have really good talent for very novel capabilities, right? So yeah, it is something we all talk about. We are very early in this process, and we are still having discussions around, which still, the office just started. But is it a model that will work? I think so, very much. I know, other competitors like Novartis and others have always had this, but we're going to test and pilot it, and I think a lot of what we're looking to do will probably simultaneously work in all of our sites, especially now that we have pretty much the same environment in all these sites. So I'm really looking forward to what the future holds there.
As someone working in the data and leading the data practice with your company, what are the biggest challenges that you face? Like maybe 2 or 3 biggest.
Yeah, so the biggest, my first challenge keeps me up at night. So I'm going to tell you, you've heard this, Bhaskar, right? I think the biggest challenge is the language and vocabulary gap between practitioners and people who make decisions to invest against these capabilities. I think technology is growing so fast and these capabilities are kind of escalating incrementally so quickly that the gap is just tremendous, right? These have become buzzwords without, and you can't blame people, right? If they're not in day-to-day interaction with what this means, it's very hard to kind of stay on top of what it really means. And you open yourself up to really be taken for a ride if you don't, and that's a gap, right? So I think what we really need, and I think what the industry really needs, is somebody to broker that debate, and that's where I love the stuff you guys are doing at AIM, because in some sense what you're doing is you're distilling kind of the stuff that people don't really need to worry about, and curating what they essentially need to breed. And the stuff you put out, for example, on LinkedIn, it's great stuff, right? Because in 5 minutes, I know exactly what I need to know, let's say, about what happened in generative AI 2 weeks ago and what's coming 6 months from now, right? And that's the kind of need I think we have, right? So that's number one. The second is talent, right? We are all in this mode where we have talent that is very well schooled in, let's say, small data, statistics, business performance analytics. But we're very quickly going into needs in data science, machine learning, AI, so how do you manage that, right? Especially in a time of growth. You can't overnight just completely, bring this talent in. You've got to upskill talent that you have. All companies are dealing with this. You have to acquire talent, which is becoming very expensive to do, right? And so this is another whole issue that I think as data and analytics practitioners we are looking at and staring at and saying, you don't want to get obsolete on skills, right?
So the second challenge is a little interesting one, because I'll tell you from my perspective, when I used to talk the biggest challenges 10 years back, it's the same one which used to pop up, which is the talent is my biggest issue. I'm not getting my good talent in data science. I would have hoped in last 10 years, 10 odd years, we should have bridged that gap. But seems there's still...
And I think I can tell you why, right? And so the way I like to explain it, right, is I think, to be a true data analytics professional, you've got to, I use this analogy all the time. You've got to be able to construct or build a quilt, right, is what I say, right? So if you take a quilt, that has 3 stages, right? You've got to first pick the patches of cloth that make the quilt. Then that to me is the stage of curation, which I know when I went to graduate school, the problem was I didn't have enough patches of cloth. Now we have too many patches of cloth, right? So the first thing I need is somebody to be able to look at millions of patches of cloth and say, hey, this pile here is what's going to matter for the question at hand. That you don't need to worry about, right? But that's just necessary, not sufficient, right? The second step is then being able to combine them in either columns or rows, so they kind of have some kind of patterns that could construct a quilt, right? To me, that's the integration stage, right? How do you take your insights? How do you take your media? How do you take, your numbers and kind of weave it together so there's cogent pieces or pillars of support for a story? The third is then putting them all together, right? Which is the storytelling aspect. I think you need A, B, and C.
You need A, B, and C in the same person, or you need...
Usually, right? Because increasingly, because of the agility of the business, you kind of have to construct it sooner rather than later, right? If you're relying on different people, it's binding on you to be able to bring those people. And also, I think if you don't understand the vocabulary of, let's say, data science, it's very difficult to construct a real story that also echoes some of, the undercurrents of this, right? So data analytics, I think, even though we're producing a lot of what I will call vertical experts, somebody who's great at Python, someone who's great at, something else, someone who's wonderful at, the analytics side of they still only have pieces of the puzzle, right? And what decision makers want, what departments need are storytellers, not just people who can write stories based on others' inputs, but people who can take the higher level inputs of functionality that go into data science, into modeling, and weave that into a story that stakeholders can understand who haven't done the modeling. That's the gap that is becoming worse with more amounts of data.
Oh, you're saying that's even getting even worse?
Oh yeah, it absolutely is getting worse because, let's say in generative AI, right? How am I going to construct now that I can, create context? To understand context, you need an understanding of numbers, images, how do you get to that? It's very difficult to do, right? And you can have different experts do it in their domains, but then you need somebody to weave it all together. They don't understand how so we are running into some of those problems.
I would have thought, given the 10 years, and maybe I'll just be a devil's advocate to the argument that you have put across, that in 10 years, let's say, this issue of someone not understanding all the three segments, it's understandable if someone is just starting out, the industry is starting out, but then someone, let's say for example, is starting with Novartis or Sanofi 10 years back, he would have understood all the three part A, B, C over this 10 long.
Yes, but the one piece, so if you look at, and I'll give you my example, right? 10 years ago, digital analytics was not a big deal, right? So let's say, so this is another dimension of the problem that you're bringing up, Bhaskar, which is equally valid, right? Is even experts in their domains need to retrain themselves because, the business analytics discipline and capabilities discipline, as you know, are not going to remain static. And they're not incrementally changing. They're disruptively changing, right? So you have to unlearn some things. If you go back, you could say, hey, I was obsessed with, in the small data world about precision and exactness. And that burst one fine morning and we don't care so much. And in fact, we need these uncertainties with massive big data sets to pick up on pattern recognition. But that's behaviorally a whole different mind shift, right?
So what you're also saying is, and I'll dig deeper into this part, that there probably might be, you're saying, is a lot of distraction in the area because the area grew so fast.
Correct.
For example,
absolutely.
AI and neural networks were not in vogue, let's say, in 2012.
Yes.
Almost all of a sudden came in 2014, 2015 when TensorFlow came in.
Yes.
So that was I would call it a distraction, though it was a progress in the whole field.
Yes.
But then there was a data scientist who was working in 2012. All of a sudden he would say, look, hey, I need to learn not hypothesis testing or regression analysis, but neural networks now.
Yes.
And probably the same thing is happening now with
absolutely.
generative AI.
Absolutely.
So the people are saying, look, nothing doing with AI, neural networks. Let me figure out what generative AI is.
Yeah, and I'm a little old school here. I think to really be proficient in something new, you have to have some functional sense of how it works, right? And so, unfortunately, one of the things with AI that we can do, and ChatGPT is a perfect case for this, is you can just let it go. You don't have to know the inner bowels of the engine, and you can let it go, right? But we can't obviously do that with analytical models, right? So
in production company, enterprise model.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not saying we're going to know what every hidden layer is doing, but you got to understand how does this engine work, right? And what is happening, what is back propagation? These are important, right? And unfortunately, we don't have that one person available off the shelf who knows these things and can actually source the inputs, be discriminating on what goes in, take the outputs, contextualize it, storytell against it. I mean, this is kind of taking very specific intelligence and making it more general and that's a talent base that's not freely available, right? I see that happen. I think that need is going to go up, right? Especially in the business context the people are going to be successful in analytics and insights going forward in all businesses are going to be functional storytellers who are also learners, who are very uneasy with static learning, right? And none of us, got schooled in AI sitting in a classroom, right? It's never going to happen. And so, that's a built-in thing people need to kind of get, right? And so that's an evolution that we're in right now.
What's the theory on the solution for a problem like this? Is it more education, more focus on?
It's continuous learning, right? I think it's continuous learning. I think it's also, somebody stepping in to kind of really focus people's attention on what matters in understanding, right? Kind of what you guys are doing, right? I think that's why this plays a very important role. I think it's people still can get away with not knowing some of those details, but not for very long, right? Because, I think in companies, people are looking more and more for people who can bridge conversations, people who can take a business problem, go to their comfort zone, look at kind of the technical details, come back and persuade against, why certain things work and certain things won't. That needs a vocabulary and training that is pretty seamless across, levels of understanding, right? And so you're going to see that happening. I think a lot of companies are looking at, they're asking the question, how do we get, talent upskilling to meet that? Nobody has, talent off the shelf to doing this, right? And that's where I see a role for, experts such as yourself and what you're trying to do with AIM, to kind of broker that conversation. What happened in MachineCon, right? Where a number of us were able to, talk to each other and lo and behold, even in that one day, I think a lot of people realize everybody else has the same problem I have, right? And that's a good starting point. And then we have to continue these conversations. We have to have these types of, forums, and I'm very thankful to AIM for doing that.
Thanks a lot, Arvind, for coming in for this podcast. It was very, very insightful. And I specifically liked two parts of it. One is all your insights about the pharma industry, etc. And also how the biggest challenge right now the industry is facing around that conversation between the business folks who are funding and who wants the outcome, and the people who are the practitioners who are working on it. So thanks a lot again, and I hope to see this again.
No, absolutely, Bhaskar. I really enjoyed myself, and thank you for the opportunity.
To support this podcast, please like and subscribe to our page. As we wrap up this riveting conversation with Arvind Balasundaram, let me leave you with some wise words from the philosopher Alan Watts, who once said, "The only way to make sense out of the change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance." This is especially true for the ever-evolving landscape of the pharma industry, a dance of data, ethics, and progress. The journey to understanding may not always be comfortable, but it's a necessary part of growth and enlightenment. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time.